The great thing about the Montreal Canadiens having the first overall pick is that everything they're doing is pretty much a formality. You know, like they're interviewing guys, they're bringing players like Logan Cooley and everything out to dinner, they're interviewing Slafkovsky and asking him about Gallagher and all that stuff. There's a whole bunch of conversation that the Montreal Canadiens as an organization are doing just as a formality. But at the end of the day, I think everybody kind of knows that Shane Wright is going to be the guy, right? No matter all the stuff that we say on this channel, no matter all the conversations that are brought up by other NHL media people, Shane Wright will be the first overall pick. And I don't think it's going to go any other way. Despite that, though, we had ourselves some comments made by Kent Hughes over the past little bit here that I just wanted to collectively put into a video just so we could have some discussion fodder as we head towards the eventual NHL draft and the end of the Stanley Cup playoffs. So I'll try to go in chronological order here just to get some Habs notes out of the way, things that we have heard but we haven't necessarily discussed at length on the channel, starting off with this radio hit that was on TSN 690 from a month ago. Yeah, a month ago, so May 5th, 2022. The comment from Kent Hughes that I wanted to talk about just to start off the video was about how he does not think the Canadiens are going to be big on free agents. Now, I will say, because this was a month ago, things can change. A lot can change in a month, right? But for Kent Hughes and the entire sentiment that the Canadiens are not going to go hard in free agency, that's something I could honestly get on board with. Because, I get it, in theory you could say, oh, you can sign a whole bunch of guys. You could become a little bit better by signing these guys, and these guys might actually become rental options at the trade deadline if they have productive years. You could, in theory, sign a guy for a year, play him, he does well, and you trade him at the deadline to get more picks. That's a pretty good win-win, right? But I think for the Montreal Canadiens, they're not necessarily the team that I feel like most players would expect that type of translation from. Mostly because you take a look at the entire body of work the Canadiens did this previous season, and you take a look at how some of the newer guys on the team ended up playing. You have players like David Savard who came in here. He wasn't really all too great. You have players like Mike Hoffman who came in here, who was supposed to be way better than he was. At the end of the day, a lot of free agents are going to look at Montreal and say, okay, well, you look at what happened last year, these guys didn't really do all too well, and the Canadiens were not able to trade them away, so what's the likelihood that I'm going to be able to execute on whatever plan it is that is similar to, okay, sign him, build up their value, trade him away? Is that really possible here? The only time I really saw that as an option that a big-name NHL free agent was trying to accomplish was Taylor Hall in Buffalo, and we all know how disastrous that entire situation was, right? So for Montreal, give the spots to younger guys, just let them go through some growing pains. Sure, if you don't sign a top-of-the-line, top-six forward, you might be losing out on 4 or 5 more games throughout the rest of the year, but that's okay. This team isn't really in a position to do all too well regardless. Now let's go over to some comments that Kent Hughes made during the draft combine. Oh my goodness, is that what it's called? Yeah, the combine, yes. As well as a few other press conference here and there. This is what Pierre-Ante Emrith said on Twitter. Kent Hughes denies the report that the Canadiens will not be drafting any Russian players at the 2022 NHL Entry Draft. I just wanted to throw that in there, not just for the Canadiens fans that are watching this video, but for the other fans too, because when it comes to Russian hockey players, believe it or not, the thing in Ukraine is actually really influential in how this entire process is going to go down. You say, oh, keep the politics out of sports, and I can agree with that to some extent. It's just in this context, the way you draft players from Russia is going to be so screwed up because when you take a look at what these guys are supposed to be, if you draft a guy from Russia, what's the plan there? He comes over to training camp, he plays with you for a little bit, maybe plays a game or two in the preseason, he gets sent back to the Russian leagues, or he gets loaned over to a league in the CHL. Well, there are already some problems with the latter because the CHL has announced that they're not going to allow any Russian or Belarusian players into their import draft. Furthermore, if you have players that are drafted by NHL teams and these Russian guys are going to have to get transferred over for training camp or for regular junior play, what are the rules going to be by the time September or October rolls around? We've seen the tension coming out of these political parties, so who knows if Russian athletes are even going to be allowed to come over to North America. There's a lot of scare there going on when it comes to projecting whether or not NHL prospects would be available to you as a team, so there is somewhat of a notion that I could see being a roadblock in this conversation, but Kent Hughes is saying, no, that's not a thing here. We're just going to draft players that we see fit. We're going to pick the best player available according to our assessment, center or not. Now, he's referring to the first overall pick, I'm pretty sure, with this quote, but it is a good philosophy to hold throughout the entire draft. As for the center argument, I mean, it just so happens to be that the first overall projected pick in Shane Wright is a center, and the Canadiens probably could use a little bit more of those, so I don't think we're going to be in for any surprises by the time draft day comes around. He also said, when it comes to that Shane Wright, he was impressed with the Canadiens meeting with the man, saying that Wright is an intelligent young man who is very mature. Now, mature when it comes to mental, that's great to see. Mature when it comes to physical, that's also great to see. We talked in yesterday's video about how, according to TVA journalist Martineau, he believes that Shane Wright could crush watermelons with his thighs because he's so physically mature. And just having that acknowledgement that this is a guy who acts older, he thinks older, his body is older than how old he really is. He's 18 years old. It's pretty good to go out there and consider when projecting what this guy could be at the NHL level right away as well. There also was one more thing I wanted to talk about here too when it comes to Kent Hughes and the interview process. The Montreal Canadiens have been making themselves known as a difficult team to interview. This is the tweet from Scott Wheeler. The Habs have a bit of a rep here as the toughest interview. Just now, Callie O'Dulia said they asked him if he would pick $10 off the toilet seat or $50 from the toilet. He chose the $50. I know. It's kind of weird, right? NHL draft combine questions are always out of the realm of realism, and you have hypothetical situations. Oh, would you rather fight 100 horse-sized ducks or one duck-sized horse? It's kind of funny, isn't it? But at the end of the day, the right answer here is $50, or you could say even $60, because you could take the 50 from the toilet, the 10 from the toilet seat. Also, in Canada, we use plastic bills, so you can just wash them off afterwards. It should be a pretty good question to assess how somebody thinks about these types of things. Either way, the Canadiens seem to be a pretty tough interview, and that reputation carried over to when the Canadiens interviewed a player whose name you might be familiar with. We talked about this guy in the Why I Want series. It's Jack Hughes, Northeastern University Huskies center, and non-relative to Quinn, Jack, and Luke. He happens to be Kent Hughes' son, and he actually said here that he tried to leave when Jack Hughes arrived for the combine interview. Jack Hughes said, Marty Lapointe said, no, you're going to stay. They asked me if I wanted my dad to stay, and I said, probably not. And then they said, hey, it's not up to you. So there was an interview done with Jack Hughes, with Kent Hughes in the room, and you know, I don't want to be that guy that pries into familial situations, but it's kind of tough to be when you have people that are this high up in the spotlight, right? I wonder what that car ride home was like. I wonder what the first meeting back at the apartment or the house was like when Kent was able to see his son Jack for the first time in a few weeks after being in Montreal with the organization. And then he's like, hey son, what's up? How are the other interviews? Is there anything you could tell me about these other GMs and these other teams? Or Jack can be like, hey dad, is there anything you can tell me about the assessment you guys had for me? I know Kent Hughes said in an interview a few weeks ago that he's not going to draft his son first overall. That would be crazy if an NHL team went out there and drafted a player just because they're related to somebody already in the organization, right? I'm looking at you, Colorado, and your Cale Makar brother, Taylor Makar. I'm looking at you, Chicago, acquiring Caleb Jones and Seth Jones in the same offseason you draft Colton Dach, Kirby Dach's brother. I'm looking at you, Arizona Coyotes, for drafting Josh Doan, Shane Doan's son. I'm looking at you, Detroit Red Wings, for drafting Keenan Draper, Chris Draper's son. And then, of course, Luke Hughes, Jack Hughes. That's the story that everybody's talking about. But either way, at the end of the day, this is a conversation that was indeed held, and it is to our current understanding that the Canadiens are not going to draft Jack Hughes because of Kent. if they do end up drafting Jack, then it might be because somebody else in the organization, or maybe a few people in the organization, are like, yeah, he is legitimately a good prospect and a good pickup in this spot. Who knows where the Canadiens are going to go? But talk to me in the comments all your thoughts about the comments that we had from Hughes over the past few weeks here, some from a month ago, some from earlier in the draft combine weekend. What are your thoughts on what he said? What are your thoughts on Shane Wright and the entire discussion that has been brought upon with him? I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.